Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv, here with another conversation episode for Pride Month. Heck yeah. I am recording this after spending like 4 days straight writing and recording like 15 episodes. So this is going to be short and brief. Today I spoke with Brendon Zatirka. We know each other through Twitter, and at some point Brendon was like, tweeted out, I'm translated Sappho, and I was like, hi. One of these days I'd love to read parts of Brendon's translation because he sent it to me and they're great and wonderful. But in the meantime, here's a conversation about translating Sappho. Translating this ancient poetry that is both Aeolic, which means it's, I've heard, a very difficult Greek dialect to learn, and also like from like 700 BCE, and also by a queer woman or an ancient woman that we can very reasonably say would be described as queer now. So we talk about translating that kind of thing, the ins and outs, Sappho as a character, as a real person. We talk about the time period and queerness generally in the ancient world and in translation. We had a really, really fun time, and I am excited for y'all to listen to it. This was recorded quite a while back now because I'd been hoarding it for Pride Month, so I'm so excited to be sharing it with you all today. It is incredibly fun, and I will take any and all opportunities to learn more about Sappho, about her work, about translation. I just absolutely love having these kinds of conversations, so I'm so thrilled to bring it to you today. Conversations, the love of a good woman. Translating Sappho with Brendon Zatirka. So why don't you, like, this is such a unique thing because I think, well, you've translated Sappho, but also just kind of, it seems like for fun / you're gonna self-publish these, so like, why don't you tell me a bit about yourself and like your translating background, and also like why Sappho? I don't know. Tell me everything, basically.
So I guess the first thing I'm gonna say is that I am at the forefront. Like I am a fantasy writer. I'm a horror fantasy writer, supernatural, whatever. And I really got into translation kind of by accident. And so it really took off around, unfortunately, like everybody has this same benchmark of COVID. And
Yep.
So I was working on a book that was out with a number of agents, and like a number of dream agents who gave me good feedback, but initially turned it down. And I was having a lot of time. I was having a big struggle with what I wanted to work on next, and none of the words were working. And so I thought, I have been reading, just little like bits of Greek here and now. Why don't I try translation and see if I can like work with somebody else's words in a different way, and see if I can like express my creativity in that way. I initially started, of course, with Euripides' Medea, and then I like dabbled in some other lyric poems, and then I always liked Sappho's, the big one, the 31. And this is just like my own personal gripe. None of the translations out there really like tickled my soul in the way that I wanted it to. And so I was like, I'm just going to do it myself. And then it just sort of took off from there. And I worked on Medea. I finished that, and it's sort of like been tucked away. I shared some of my work on, Twitter and Instagram, and it like accidentally like gathered a bunch of people that liked it. I was like, okay, so I'll just keep doing that. And then last winter, I was like, I'm just going to do Sappho's entire corpus, or at least the bits that I could make sense out of. And that's sort of where I am.
I mean, amazing. Yeah, the Sappho's so interesting for that, like, bits you can make sense of, because it is so fragmentary, and like some, are these like sort of coherent pieces, even if they're really short. And then of course we have like, is it just like the one confirmed long one, like full?
Yeah, I think they say that the very first fragment is the only one that they technically consider complete.
Right. And then I know there was like that possible fake one, which I never kept track enough of. But I like the story from what little I know, because it's horrifically bananas. Yeah, no, I mean, Sappho's so interesting because she is so fragmentary, and like, yeah, I imagine it would be quite fun to kind of play around with that. And I mean, she's just so cool. I have such a thing for like how we have her work, in that primarily it's all like really accidental, and like these little pieces that were just like found on other things. And the sort of transmission of that kind of stuff is my little pet obsession, and I don't know enough about it, but I love whatever I learn. But yeah, I mean, like, I don't even know what to ask, because it's just such a fun thing. And like Sappho's so interesting. But she is like, I don't even know. Like, basically, maybe, did you have favorites? Like, did you learn something really cool about Sappho? Like, what are your thoughts on her? And like, maybe that'll give me actual questions to ask you, because I'm bad at that, apparently.
I think I ran into more favorites. I had actually never read her work in translation before. I read like parts of Anne Carson's translation, but not from cover to back. And so getting into some of the poems that I hadn't known myself was actually really fun. And it really, I learned more about how she would structure a Greek sentence as opposed to like Homer, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And it was just really interesting to see the flow of her words in its original form. But also I would like discover just how sensual a lot of her poetry is, the kinds of things that she focuses on, the touching, the sense in terms of what she sees and what she hears. It's just very interesting to me. And that's kind of like what kept me going through all of the like really difficult parts.
Well, yeah, because it's also like Aeolic Greek. Like there's so much going on in Sappho that makes her kind of like atypical, even if you are, familiar with ancient Greek more broadly. Like I have a Sappho fragment tattoo, and every time I'm in Greece, like 10 to 15 different people will be like, oh, that's Greek. And I'll be like, yeah, can you read it? And they're like, no, it's nonsense. And I'm like, I know, because even though like a lot of times, modern Greeks can speak, or not speak, but like can read like decent amounts of ancient Greek, because they're so, they're so similar, or at least lots of it is similar. But then there's this Aeolic. And so like I even had somebody once who was looking at it, and he was like so sure that he would know because like of an ancient Greek knowledge, and he was like, it's misspelled. And I was like, I don't think it is, but like, I mean, if it is, like, maybe, but I've got it direct from the Anne Carson, so it's her fault if not. But like I was like, I think that the issue, because he was like, it shouldn't be like, it starts with a psi, and he was like, it should be something else. And I was like, I think that's the Aeolic coming in, because like even Sappho's name, in Aeolic Greek is Sappho. Yeah. It's like not even starting with a sigma, like it is starting with a psi. And so like, I don't know. I know so little. I don't know enough ancient Greek, but like, I just fucking love learning shit like that. And it makes me just think that like, yeah, translating her Aeolic Greek, from like she's all the way off in Lesbos, like, whereas so much of what we have is from Athens. Like, I just can imagine that it would be like particularly difficult.
So obviously, like most people. So first off, I need to just say I'm like self-taught in ancient Greek.
Amazing.
I never took it in undergrad because it never aligned with my schedule or grad school. And so I obviously learned like Attic, and I started with a lot of the tragedians, and then I like moved into Homeric, which to me is kind of like the easiest, even if there's like a few different shades of difference. It took me so long to even just get into the groove of Sappho's Aeolic. The spelling would always catch me up. I'd be like, oh, that's a word that I know, but then it wasn't, or like, I think I know it. Or then it turns out to be a really simple word that, of course, I know that.
Yeah, like I get the sense that it is just like often like little spelling differences, like little like a psi instead of a sigma, if for that, you know, like which would be extra difficult, I would imagine, because yeah, like it's close, but like not quite, you know, the word you're expecting it to be.
And then I think there's a lot of different vowel shifts. There's a lot more, I think, the Adas than in their Attic forms.
Interesting.
And so also different like other consonants swap out for other consonants. I like it all like bled out of my head for now, but
Valid. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Self-taught generally I love, because I mean, I do have a classics degree, but like I didn't get to learn the languages, and like 99% of what I know at this point is self-taught. Like, not least because my degree is really old and I barely remember it, but I also like the stuff that I have taught myself in this podcast is like so by and large more valuable than anything I learned in my degree. So it's just so interesting, and like, yeah, I just think there's something like really valid about teaching yourself something like that because you just like want to. And ancient Greek is so lovely. Like if I had a little bit more time and I didn't already have to devote like every moment of my waking life to ancient Greece, like I would absolutely learn it. I love it so much. And all the little things that I do learn along the way, because I just do a lot of like creeping on Perseus and trying to like figure shit out for myself. Like it's just always so much fun. So I can just only imagine like teaching yourself, but then also translating like that. I just, yeah, I'm jealous, basically, is what I'm saying. Yeah, Sappho is just so interesting. Like, did you do research into her, you know, or what little we do know of her, much as like a person, or just like kind of focus on the translation?
And so I've been teaching, I teach Greek and Latin literature and translation in the humanities department at a number of city colleges. And so I'm familiar with her enough in that aspect. So I had to like prepare lecture material on her. And so I knew of Sappho and I knew what she was like a writer of. And I was familiar with, you know, Anne Carson and a number of the other like archaic translations of her stuff. And so it was really just like, I finally got a chance to just dive into her world myself. Like I knew who this woman was to whatever extent that we could say that. And I could finally like look at her language myself. And so that was like really part of like the discovery of Sappho. Like I knew of Sappho and I knew enough about her life, but like when you get into her language, I feel like you learn so much more of that person, even though we only have fragments of her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that really stood out to me was just incredibly how like queer, quote unquote, her stuff even is. There's all this talk about like, is she writing about friends? Is she writing about people that she's really interested in? Is she queer? Is she actually a lesbian? Does she like men? But I mean, those people that posit those arguments, I think are like, I don't know. I feel like it's pretty obvious to me as a, you know, queer person.
Yeah, no, I mean, you basically transitioned to exactly what I was going to try to figure out how to ask, because it is such a funny argument. Like, I mean, you know, there's so much to be said for placing modern, you know, sexualities and things like on to the ancient world generally, but they do it all the time with straight people. So it's like, okay, like chill out. Like I remember I forget how it happened, but I was like, again, in Greece, apparently that's all my stories. And I like mentioned Sappho came up I was in a shop and talking to a guy, and he like went on and on about the like Ovid story, like as if that was like absolutely factual about her life. And like, you know, to the listeners, I've not ever told that Ovid Herodes because I don't like it. But like basically it posits the idea that like Sappho killed herself over a man. And it's like, one, Ovid lived like 700 years after her, so like let's be honest about his ability to tell that if he's the only one. And also like absolute bullshit, not at all. Like, I mean, like the straight washing of her would be like a problem in itself, but the idea of her also, anyway, it's wrong. So but I love that. Like I mean, I think to say that at the very like the broad word of just saying that she was queer feels to me to be like deeply accurate and like problematic to suggest otherwise, even if you don't want to prescribe like what, you know, specific modern type of queerness she might have inhabited. You know, like the woman was queer. But like, yeah, when it comes to those poems that really stood out to you, like, I mean, what was it about them, I guess? Like, because, you know, you mentioned the idea that, like, people say, like, oh, yeah, was she writing about friends? Or, like, I know there's also the argument that's, like, was she writing for other people? You know, like, was she writing a love poem to a woman for a man? You know, like, you know, that's, I think, how a lot of people have, like, written off the idea that she was queer. But yeah, like, did anything specific stand out to you about that?
I think one of the things that stood out to me, and I fall into the camp of, I think that many like scholars bend over backwards to erase this kind of queerness from her narrative. I mean, the story that she has a husband whose name is like Big Dick of Man Island
Yeah.
is just, it's just so funny to me. And the fact that Ovid says this, that she like killed herself over a man, I think is ridiculous, because if you look at her poetry of what we have, the vast majority of it is aimed at women.
Mm-hmm.
And the real only men that she talks about are like nameless grooms in her marriage poems, her brothers, and then a few mythological figures.
Hmm.
And I think that one thing that really stood out to me is just the way that she has an eye for detail in regards to women. Like, a lot of the time she's focusing on the dressing of the woman. You know, she looks at the dress, she talks about how beautiful it is, or how it fits on their body, or just basically calling that woman beautiful in any language that she can. And so in my head, I'm like, God, a queer person obviously wrote this. Like a really thirsty queer person. And whether or not that love was like reciprocated, you know, Sappho was definitely like thirsty.
I'm writing that line down because I think I want to make it the title. So just give me just a really thirsty queer person. I feel like that fits wonderfully. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think that's such a, like, what a lovely way of seeing it that way, but it does make so much sense. I haven't read her, you know, cover to cover either, or obviously you have. I haven't read her cover to cover. But like, mostly because I just don't read just straight poems like that. I wish I did. I have an English degree. I should. But yeah, you know, but from what I've seen, like, I've always just, the stuff I've read have been like, this just feels like it's woman to woman.
Yeah.
From my, like, you know, at this point I like to say I'm vaguely straight because it doesn't make any sense for every single thing in my life. But you know, like, it just, I read her stuff and I just think, yeah, like, it, I mean, I guess I personally focus on her more as being a woman poet whose work survived, because like, from it, like, to me that's just like so fucking amazing. And like,
yeah,
I can't stop thinking about it. So like, I've thought a little bit less about her sexuality, but more so in the way where I'm just like, well, I'm just assuming she's queer because everything about that makes more sense to me. But what I love is, you know, that like, this woman's work survived in this way, you know, and the way that she was so well respected in her time, from as far as we can tell, which I think is so lovely and really meaningful, and is like kind of a nice, like, not necessarily a reminder, but like maybe a possibility that the reason why we don't have more of hers, or why it is so random and fragmentary, is more about the Christians who came after her than it is about, you know, the ancient Greeks who seem to have actually respected her talent. I'm not, again, forming this into a question, but Sappho is so interesting. So I love hearing that that's kind of what stood out most, and it feels so right. It feels like a very, yeah, I mean, yeah, sounds like a thirsty queer person, basically. But I like, yeah, so did you find like that, you know, when she's writing about men, it's pretty obviously different? Like, it just like totally lacks that kind of detail, or just like there's less of it? I mean, I know there's also just less of it, but
I mean, I guess from what I'm remembering, you know, I actually haven't looked at my stuff in a very long time, but I feel like she does not really focus on the physical aesthetic of men quite often, unless she's talking about like Adonis or some other male, you know, mythological hero, or if she's talking about a groom in a wedding song, but she's also referring to brides in that song. So she's never really focusing on like the beauty of men. That to me seems like she's like, oh, I love this guy, in the same way that she's like talking about women.
Mm-hmm. I went through, and I think I actually must have read all of them now that I think about it. Certainly all the fragments of your translation, and like pulled out a bunch of my favorite ones. But of course, brains are weird, and that was like a month ago, and now I've forgotten everything. But like, I mean, I think it's so interesting the way that she writes about love generally, not least because it's sort of unique in the ancient world, even if it's just because we don't have a ton of like love poetry from ancient Greece more broadly. And I love that it's so much more just like about the people. Like we're so used to, particularly from ancient Greece, the poetry is so mythological. It is so based in storytelling, and like it just, serves this really different purpose than, just this poet off in this random Eastern island, like writing about all the hot women that she encounters. Like it just feels so unique generally, that apparently, again, I'm just going to say, like, I just think Sappho's really interesting. Do you have like a favorite poem that stood out that you remember, or some, I don't even know. So I like weird random things, that might have come up if you recall. And if not, I'll cut out me asking, so don't worry.
Oh geez. There were a number of those like one line little fragments that I just really enjoy just because of their simplicity. Well, obviously we only have the one line. Who knows if they were part of like larger poems, but the simplicity of them and just like the things that she chooses to pay attention to, like it's like a really insignificant line, but the fact that she like, we have a little fragment of her talking about like the way that chickpeas grow on a shoreline, or the way that, she hints at the myth of, oh God, who is that? The one where it's like, they say that Leda came across an egg of cloudy blue, in reference to the myth of like the swan eggs. And it's like, it's those small little details that she pays attention to. But I think the one that really is my favorite currently is the one, the winter one, the one that Anne Carson's translation gets its title from. And I like it in itself because it's kind of like broken up and it's so interesting, but I also just like my own translation of it because of the flow that I managed to get in it.
Amazing. Do you have it open? Is it short? Do you want to read it?
I actually, yeah, sure. So keep in mind, this is all fragmentary. It's got ellipses, it's got brackets, all those cool things. The work, a splendid face, a pleasant knot, not winter time, not with an ache. I beg you take the lyre until again desire flies all around you, beautiful. Her dress excites you when you see, and so I smile. And Aphrodite once upon a time accused me when I prayed. This word, I wish.
Oh, I love that. The fragmentary nature does lend itself so well to it, though. Like it is, I mean, one, I know people talk about this all the time, but like visually, it's really like interesting to see those like ellipses and the brackets, like you're talking about. Because it is just like, it feels so Sappho at this point, but yeah, like the fragmentary nature also just like really does lend itself to that type of poetry, and it feels very like angsty in a lovely like emo kid kind of way. If I'd known more about Sappho, back in the early 2000s, like I would have used her lyrics as my like MSN status instead of all of the emo songs. But like, I just, she feels like that to me in a way. And then even just, the reference to the dress. Yeah. Like I know I just want to go through all of them and like pick out everything. I just, yeah, I think it is just like what I'm sort of focusing on is how different it is to me in terms of what I read, because it really is just like this nice love poem that it almost feels like she's not necessarily writing this stuff. Or, I mean, you know, of course she also would have like sung it and played music to it, which is hard to kind of keep in your mind in a modern context. But like, it almost feels like she's not writing it for other people so much as it is just like a journal kind of thing, you know? And it feels like a peek, I guess, into an ancient woman, which is why I just keep focusing on that part, because it's so nice and rare.
No, I agree with you. I think I don't really buy into the argument that she might have been writing for other people. You know, maybe she was at some point, but you're right that a lot of her work does feel very like a journal or a diary. It feels like very much like she is putting herself into it.
Yeah, it just feels like her own, her own thoughts, and that's why it does feel unrealistic, this idea that she was writing these poems for women, but like writing them for men, you know, writing to a woman. Not least because, like, one, it just feels unlikely, but two, like, I don't know, was it supposed to be convincing? Because like if I read that, I wouldn't be like, yeah, that man wrote it. You know, like it does feel like a woman writing for a woman, because it just has this like, or this, you know, like certainly wouldn't assume like a straight man wrote it for, you know, like it just feels like, come on, you know, unless he's Ovid, which is ironic for me to say because I just edited an episode on Ovid's Ars Amatoria, which is a whole other beast, you know. But it feels so much like the way a woman would talk about another woman, and you know, like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like a straight woman, I guess. That's my point. But I just, I also do love I like the idea that the joke was that she was married to a guy that's named, like, you know, Big Dick from Man Island. Like, I like that it was an actual tongue-in-cheek joke in the ancient world that was like making not fun, but like almost just like making, so it was like sort of, it was so obvious that she loved women that they would just joke about that, you know, like that is what feels right to me about that, rather than, you know, some weird straight washing idea. Like, it's a good joke. Like,
so one of the classes that I teach, I structured it myself. It is, you know, love in the ancient world. And I jumped at that tweet that you posted a few days ago, because it was like literally in the top of my head, like, there's not a single happy ending in Greek mythology. And we talk about this in my class so much. And then one of the things that usually in every semester that I've taught this class, people always point out, Sappho is so clearly talking about a woman, because the way that she talks about women is so different from like Ovid or Catullus, how they write poetry about women. And I think Catullus can be somewhat romantic in some ways, but I think that the things that they pay attention to, men, are so different from what Sappho is giving us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing, right? It does. Yeah, it just doesn't feel like a love poem written by a straight person, or at the very least a straight man. Because, like, yeah, I mean, that's why I think, yeah, like, no, she couldn't have convinced anyone that was written by a dude. It's just, yeah, focusing on different things, prioritizing different things, like being attracted to different things. Like, it feels like very non-traditional. Like, again, like, I have the Ars Amatoria in my head right now, and, you know, like, it is the exact opposite of that, right? Like Ovid's Ars is him being like, you know, here is every cliche stereotype about what men want in women that somehow have existed for 2,000 years, because they're all exactly the same now, which is horrifying. You know, and then he's like, play up these ladies, like, don't, there was one line that's like, you know, if you have big teeth, don't laugh too big. Like that's the shit that men write about women, even in the ancient world. And then meanwhile, Sappho's like, her dress was so pretty. Like, you know, it's just like, it's so different. And she is just so unique. And I mean, it's so interesting to me how little she really is studied, and maybe it's because, you know, when I did my degree there was certainly nothing like that. Like all the classes that exist now I'm so jealous of, because like mine was, it was so simple. But yeah, like, you know, I feel like she's just not talked about enough, and then so often when she is, it's like, but was she queer? And it's like, I mean, you know, part of it is like, what is the point of trying to make her into a straight woman? Like, it's bizarre and pointless and entirely rooted in, you know, all of this patriarchal Christian, like, Western nonsense. But also it's like, I feel like she would be mad. She'd be like, I'm a fucking poet and you're still reading my shit like almost 3,000 years later. Like, let it speak for itself, kind of, you know. And I don't want to, you know, suggest that we should just like not talk about her sexuality at all, but at the same time, like yeah, I mean, her poetry does kind of speak for itself, and it's fucking screaming that she likes ladies. I don't know.
Because when I think of like Anacreon, or even sometimes Pindar has some like really homoerotic poems, like just the way that like queer men talk about other men, and the way that Sappho writes about women is just very different from like Ovid, Catullus, and like a few of the other Romans, or like other, you know, straight-ish poets.
Ish. Yeah. Okay, now I have a like, so the only Anacreon that I have read is a poem about basically breaking a woman like a horse. So I'm like, I mean, I don't want to make this about Anacreon at all, but like, does he write nicer stuff? Like, you mentioned him alongside Pindar, so I'm just like, now I'm generally curious, and I should maybe look at him more. But
a lot of his stuff, his like shorter fragments, are very centered on men, and he's often paying attention to them, and he's like calling them like, you know, pretty, or like, you know, he says, don't you see how I fancy you, or stuff like. One of my favorites from him, and this is mine, is he says, men would love me for my words, for I sing sweet things, know to say sweet things. And so he's very sensual in the same way that Sappho is, and not like Ovid or Catullus.
Yeah. I guess, except for the time he wrote about breaking a woman like a horse. But yeah, you know, I like to know about that one too. I'm glad I asked. I found it in a very, like, I should say, I did not believe it was necessarily, you know, indicative of all of his work, but it was funny. I think I Googled like raunchy Greek love poems or something. Just anyway, that's for a different project. Yeah, it's. Yeah, Sappho stuff is just so pretty. This is just the episode of me saying that I just find her cool and pretty and interesting, which is again where I go, you know, I call myself somehow questionably straight, even when I talk about Sappho. But no, it's, so you mentioned, you know, this will be airing in June, but you and I are talking about I did tweet last week for looking for Valentine's Day ideas. It's just like, I want a love story. Like, I think I said romance. I think the key I was saying I would like a romance from Greek myth that ends in a happy ending, and then in quotations, or in brackets rather, Cupid and Psyche doesn't count. I want it Greek. And then of course I did get a response that said, what about Eros and Psyche? And I said, we got things to talk about here, but that's not it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The person, I'm sure, didn't register that I'd explicitly said they don't count. But yeah, it is true. Like, there isn't. That was the general consensus. I ended up writing an episode on Pygmalion instead. I went the other way. And just a note, if you haven't read Stephanie McCarter's translation, at least of, I mean, her stuff is generally so good, but her Pygmalion is like maybe perfect. I just nearly died laughing. But yeah, like Greek myth specifically when it comes to romance, not happy endings, especially queer ones though. Like, they all die. It's always Apollo or Zeus, like falling in love with a dude and having that poor guy die. Like, I think of Hyacinthus. I googled like Greek myth love stories, which is always a shit show generally, not least because it's always Ovid, and I'm like, what did I say? I want Greek. But yeah, you know, like Hyacinthus was like on all the lists, and I was like, I mean, I guess, but like you call it a romance, but like I just think that's a bummer if they always die in the end. In which case, like in that case, getting hit by a fucking frisbee, like. There's just so much, but I love the idea that Sappho stuff, like, while not mythology, like, it's not like happy ending, but it is hopeful in a lot of cases, and like romantic and hopeful in this way that just does not exist in my experience from ancient Greece.
No, there is this like really, I feel like it's a very like modern and something like when you have like your first crush in like middle school or high school, and there's this like intense longing for that person or just to even like be noticed by them. And I feel like that kind of desire is very present all throughout Sappho's work. I mean, the jealousy poem is the most obvious one, but I think it's very scattered throughout her work.
Yeah, no, but it does, like, it feels like an emo journal, like Live Journal. Do you get that reference? How many of my listeners will?
Oh my God.
I know. Like,
I like stumbled across my Live Journal like 3 years ago, and I was like, oh my God, why is this still up? Oh my God, I wrote this in high school. Oh God, this is horrible.
I didn't have a Live Journal, but I do wish every day that I could go in and like get a log of all of my ridiculously emotional like song lyrics as MSN status updates. You're just like, you want your crush to pay attention to you, so you put in like a really emo song lyric and you're like, look, I'm a sad message, I can see you're online. Anyway, these are like niche 2001 references. But like yeah, that's what it feels like though, you know, like it. And I think that, and this might be like a downer to bring it up, but it is unfortunately very relevant, but I think that is another great example or piece of evidence for her queerness, because obviously there were, you know, the same number of queer people, like statistical wise, you know, in the ancient world, but they weren't allowed to like necessarily be that way openly. And so, you know, like I imagine if you are a woman writing love poetry to other women, like it's pretty angsty, because even if they love you back, like it takes a lot to be able to like do anything real in that kind of like to have any kind of real romantic relationship. And maybe it was better on Lesbos, like, you know, so much of what we have is in Athens, where like if women were, you know, together, they were doing it in secret. I'm so convinced that was why they all hung out all of the time, and men didn't think it was sex because they only believed in penetration as sex. But like, you know, I imagine it would be tricky even on Lesbos to like find a girl who could actually, even if she did like you back, but like was actually willing to do something about it. I don't know. It just feels so real, and like it just feels like such a real person writing stuff that's what makes her so special.
It's really interesting to me, especially like clearly I'm not a lesbian, but like ancient lesbianism or same-sex attraction between women, don't want to like
Sapphic,
put a label on
you
it.
could even call it.
We'll use that. One of the things that's really interesting to me about it is because it's so quiet in the texts. Like Plato, the whole like Aristophanes' story in Plato's Symposium about like the circle people, like he spends a whole paragraph talking about like how men are attracted to men because it's like the manliest like kind of love. It's like the most like it's got the most integrity or whatever. And he has like one line that's like, women who are attracted to women don't speak to men. And that's about it. There's like one line dedicated to that specific form of desire. And for me, I think you're right. Like that's why women were hanging out all the time. Like, come on. Like I'm sure tons of women loved other women.
Yeah.
Like the fact that we have like a huge queer population today, it doesn't mean that like there were no queer people back then. It just means that people had to, you know, find other ways of expressing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, it makes me think of, I try to bring this up as often as possible, but like, you know, there are stories of trans people in the ancient world. Like it's not new. It's just simply that people are slightly, unfortunately, not as much as it should be, but like allowed to be that way. You know, like it's not like people are suddenly there's more trans people or more gay people. It's just like, no, like the world has just become marginally slightly kind of better, except maybe it's turning around, but hopefully not. Everything's garbage right now. But like, yeah, I mean, I say this on the show all the time because I have this like very long standing theory about how many women were probably in what they were able to see as like pretty great romantic relationships, because at the very least in Athens, like the men were like, they're not doing anything, they're just the wives. The wives spend time together because they're not really allowed to be anywhere else. They're just doing wifely things. And meanwhile the ladies are like, this is pretty chill. Like, I'm married to this guy because I have to, but like he's always off, like, you know, with doing his own thing. There's a lot to do there. And you know, and she's got all of her, you know, quote unquote friends, or that one really good friend that she spends all of her time with. And like, I just love this idea that that they probably didn't even conceptualize women having sex. They probably, for the most part, thought that it was like impossible and thus was not an issue. You know, because they're just so like the Symposium is the greatest example. Like Plato wrote an entire thing about love. A huge portion of it is about men loving other men, granted in, you know, very problematic pederastic ways. But like a huge part of it is about having real and lasting and romantic relationships between men. And then he's like, ladies, I don't know. You know, like it just feels like this kind of bizarre blind spot where it's just like it didn't exist. And you're like, well, what are the chances it didn't exist, or the men were just not paying attention? It's just, yeah. I mean, the ancient world generally, like looking at queerness as we can conceptualize it in the ancient world, is so interesting.
And so difficult to talk about in just modern language too. And people always want to put it into boxes, and it's like, no, it's a little bit more fluid than that. And I always just like, with my students, I say, you know, I'm using these words right now, but it was a little more like loosey-goosey back then.
Yeah, I like to say, like, you know, there's somebody who, you know, safely kind of call queer, but like if we were to put a more specific modern label on it, we would say, you know, X. Like, and then of course, do you know the history of how we got to a point where the word lesbian means you're from Lesbos, and the word sapphic comes from Sappho and basically means, you know, lesbian. And yet we have this entire existence of people being like, Sappho was straight. Like, I just feel like there are two like very like contradictory notions out in the world. Do you know anything about like the history of the words versus like straight washing her?
I honestly, that's actually a really good question. Now I feel like I need to go deep diving into that.
Yeah, I think I probably will before this episode airs, because I'm like, I have to know.
I mean, I feel like the word lesbian must come around the time that a lot of Sappho stuff is getting sort of rediscovered in the Victorian period.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also like around the time when, like, you know, Oxford and Cambridge start like straight washing a lot of stuff. And like, I think, I mean, I actually have no idea. I'm going to have to dive into that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because it feels so contradictory, you know, and I think, and I am obligated to both say that I recognize that in modern Greek it is Lesbos. I understand this. I am saying Lesbos because we won't get into it. But I recognize that. And in addition, I have to always mention, I don't know if we were mutuals at this time. It was years ago now, but I did an episode on Sappho a couple of years ago, and I did get a DM from a nice young woman. I'm going to assume her profile photo was Taylor Swift, so tough to say. And it was the greatest thing that's ever happened to me, because it was like this big long message, and it was like, hi, I found your podcast and I was scrolling through episode titles. Note, did not say they were listening. Scrolling through episode titles, and I just wanted to let you know that you used a slur.
Oh my God.
She was like, lesbo is a slur. And I was like, and then went on even better to be like, if you're a lesbian, then it's okay with me. Something where it was like very specifically like they were giving me permission. If you're a lesbian, then it's okay. But if you're not, I would appreciate you taking it down or something. And I was like, it's an island. It's an island where we get the word lesbian from. It is the history of your people. If what you're saying to me means you are a lesbian yourself, like it is literally the etymological history of your people. And you are telling me that I've used a slur. And anyway, I just like screenshotted it and posted it, and then it went viral, and it became a whole thing where now a large part of my friend group refers to Lesbos as Slur Island. Anyway,
I actually remember that.
I'm glad. It was peak. It was my favorite moment on Twitter ever. Was the way that took off from me being like, I was giving you a history of Sappho. What are you talking about? Like literally the episode title was like Sappho the lesbian from Lesbos. Like I was making it pretty fucking clear. Like even grammatically it couldn't have been a slur. Like anyway, it was a joy. And I think about it every time I think about Sappho. But she, you know, anyway, that it gets down to I am so curious about the etymology there, because especially sapphic, like her name is so synonymous with queerness, but specifically with lesbianism. Like how did it become this thing where we're really arguing about whether or not, you know, she liked women? It just feels so nonsense, which of course so much of general homophobia is nonsense, so it's impossible to understand, but I still, you know, get baffled.
I think like one thing that I like enjoyed about my own working with the translation, and something that I don't see a lot with Sappho specifically, is meter. And a lot of I've seen some people try to do meter with Sappho. It works. Whether or not the lines themselves like are good sentences, to me, it's like a coin toss. I've got gripes with translations, but I'll be kind about that. And so one thing that I really wanted to stick to, because I didn't want to just be like, oh yeah, I'm doing Anne Carson, because Anne Carson's poetry is so beautiful, but it's also like, it's not so much focused on the meter. She's much more focused on the way that a sentence can flow or end, and like the kind of word choices and the content that she can use with that ambiguity and the breaking of the fragments. Whereas I really wanted to like lean into the meter because, you know, she was a musician. She did sing these songs, or they were sung. And, you know, there's a whole like specific kind of metrical verse that's named after her. And so I wanted to like really honor the meter in her poetry.
That's really interesting. It sounds like you have more to say, which is great because I do want to hear more. Also, I did not know that there's like a meter. I never think of meter, so I'm really glad you brought it up. I'm not a poetry girl, even though it's what I do for a job, is read ancient poetry.
Yeah, there's this, I just want to look at my intro because that's where all this stuff is. So she's known, they call it a sapphic stanza because she's the one who's sort of like, using the word invent is so problematic in a number of ways, but I'm just going to use it anyway. She like invented, or at least made it popular, of this stanza where it's like 3 longer lines that have a very specific like lyric meter that's too complex for me to even like get into, and then like a shorter line. So you have like a 4-line stanza where you have 3 and then a half line. And most of her first book of poems, consist of that stanza. And then some of her later works, they follow, dactylic hexameter. She's pulling from the epic tradition, or she's like playing around with some other stuff. And so I also wanted to like maybe play around with meter a lot throughout the poems.
Yeah. I mean, just even hearing that, and again, like I don't have a lot of, grounding in meter. But it feels to me like, again, it's another good example of how her stuff feels a little more natural and playful than a lot of what else we have. Like it does feel like she's just kind of having fun, like almost like she's just doing this because she loves it. And like I imagine that's true of all the other poets, but it does feel like more formal, I guess, in terms of what I've read. But again, I do tend to stick to mythology other than my just general love of Sappho. But like, yeah, like I mean, yeah, she just seems to be having fun. So like I like hearing the idea that she was, playing around with other meters in addition, to something like dactylic hexameter, which is so. What I know is that it is from the epic storytelling. But like, God, I have an English degree. It's I like the idea that she's playing around with that a little bit more, mostly because I just like the idea that she was just like a fun woman doing what she loved, and we still talk about her 2,700 years later. Like that just feels so fucking cool. So I did like meant to bring up how I very much like that you were able to rhyme liar with desire in your translation, because I feel like and maybe this is just me, I feel like that would be like a really satisfying thing to realize that you can do.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like
it was actually kind of
ancient.
like an accidental rhyme too.
Love it.
That was one of the things that I also wanted to focus on, because in Sappho's, in the Greek, there's a lot of like alliteration and internal rhyme. I don't know if she did it on purpose or if it was just because that's how Greek was at the time, that's how it worked. But I also wanted to try to fit in a few of those sort of internal rhymes, and a lot of them accidentally ended up being just on accident, just pure happenstance. I mean, like that line in specific.
That feels very right, that just kind of happens that way. I'm so curious about like when you said, whether it's just that Greek was that way. Like, I mean, so much of any Greek that was written down was because it was poetry and so often epic poetry. So I feel like, it would have just kind of been a language that just sounded more poetic, because the entire purpose to so much of the development of their language was to like record kind of these sorts, I guess, written language. But like, I just love that idea. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know the precise like division, but from what it looks like, it seems that there's a lot more poetry that's been preserved than just like regular prose. But, I might be wrong about that.
Well, I don't think that they were typically, and maybe it is a preservation, but as far as I understand it, it was like just not common to write anything in prose until somebody like, or get closer to like Plato's time when he's doing that. But I think that it makes a lot of sense, that because, until we have people like Plato and Herodotus, so maybe Herodotus being first, not maybe, definitely. Jeez, I'm doing well today. Herodotus came first. I want to acknowledge that I know that. Like before we get to these people like Herodotus and Plato who are writing things for such a specifically different purpose, like I feel like that's kind of when, this is me bullshitting, but like I feel like that's kind of when, prose became more, commonly used, but it's all about functionality, right? Like it's just, they were writing poems because that's literally what they did. They wrote, but it's more because they were songs, right? They're poems because they were sung, until people like Herodotus come along and they're like, nah, I just want to share history with you. I don't need to sing it. That'd be weird. But, like, I like thinking about that kind of side of it, of just like, I mean, the ancient world is so interesting because everything developed out of necessity more than intention. And it's so different from our world now that it's interesting.
Because you get these like really like brilliant poets, like whoever wrote the Homeric epics, like Sappho and all the other lyric poets, Pindar, who's kind of a mess if you look at his Greek, it's so complicated. And then like all the playwrights, they were poets, they were plays, they were dramatic performances, but everything was done in meter. And so it's so interesting that you get like Herodotus, Thucydides, who writes some really long sentences.
Well, they also didn't have punctuation.
No.
So, like, I just, like, that's in its own thing, you know? Like, these are things that we don't think about until it's, like, pointed out. And then I also feel like it's easy to forget, you know, that, like, they didn't have punctuation. They didn't have spaces between words. They didn't have uppercase or lowercase. We were just looking at a series of Greek letters all next to each other and figuring it out. And, like, I like to remind people that, like, the plays didn't have stage directions or even tell us who was saying what line. Like, it's all just figure it out. And so, yeah, like, I mean, it makes sense, I guess, that poetry was the main form of everything for so long, not least because they were sung. You know, even the Homeric poems, you know, yeah, again, whoever wrote them, there's no way anyone will ever convince me that the same guy wrote both. They are completely contradictory. But like, even those, when they were finally written down, was about preservation, not about reading them. Like, so these things were just meant to be sung and recited in that kind of way. So, like, of course they're songs. Or rather, of course they're poems. Like, and the meter, of course, comes with that, like, because the meter is all about memorizing it, which, again, like, I just think we don't think about in our modern world, but, like, meter exists so that memorization was easier. And, like, oh my god, anyway, sorry, now I'm just, like, getting existential with my ancient world. So you write horror mostly, you said, right?
And fantasy, yeah.
And fantasy, yeah. Like, I don't see necessarily how these things can connect, but, like, I'm fascinated if anything, even in your head, in, like, as you're translating these things, or if it, like, inspired you to go from there, like, to your typical genre. Like, I've been writing fantasy lately, or trying to, but, like, in a Greek myth realm, and I feel like, I don't know, Sappho doesn't feel like necessarily something that would lend itself to those genres, but I'm curious.
It's funny that you mentioned Hyacinthus, because I did write a short story about him a few years ago that got published, and then I did also write a version of Orpheus's death, which was very, like, horror inspired.
I would hope so. That's amazing.
But with Sappho, I think I maybe have taken like descriptions from Sappho that I think were really rich and, like, almost tactile. But I haven't really been inspired by her work in terms of transfiguring it into fantasy or horror. But her stuff is so vibrant that I think it sort of, like, inspires my own personal word choice when I get into actually writing my own stuff. That's actually one thing that I noticed when I started translating in earnest, you know, between Euripides, the Odyssey, which is just metaphorically so crazy and so beautiful in a number of ways, and then Sappho, my own writing became a little more vibrant. I think, like, the Greeks just have, like, such interesting metaphors that I think it pushes me to think about, like, language and imagery in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I just like that. Now I think that's very poignant, and I love it. And I also, though, because you brought it up, do want to hear about Hyacinthus and Orpheus's death as horror. How did you handle Hyacinth, if you want to talk about it, I should say. But I'm so curious.
So I kind of pulled from a number of sources, and the crux of it was that it was kind of a love triangle that I pulled from, like, Zephyrus and then Apollo, both wanting him for some reason or another. And, like, both of these relationships, Hyacinthus, they're both toxic in a number of ways. And he's just, like, I mean, this is like, to me, a very quintessential queer experience where you find yourself in a relationship where you like, you long for them, you like them, you know you know that they're bad for you, you know that they have these like blaring red flags, and you're just like, I'm gonna wear my rose tinted glasses. And that's really the crux of that short story. It was all about the longing that Hyacinthus has for Apollo, while at the same time it's not a happy ending. he dies, and I don't know. It's a very tragic story, and I actually did borrow a lot of Ovid's imagery from that.
Mm. It's a beautiful story that's so horrifying. Like, not least because I have trouble with Apollo generally, and like seeing any kind of redemption in him. So I'm always just like, well, I feel like, he was shittier than he seemed, even in whatever source that we might have. But yeah, that's really interesting. I generally just, I mean, I love and hate that story. I love that it is like this triangle, because like in terms of sources, it's like I think Zephyr's always involved, but it's like sometimes Hyacinthus loves Zephyr and sometimes he loves Apollo, and it's kind of like what is kind of going on in that realm. And it's, I don't know, it's interesting especially because Zephyrus is like such a minor god by comparison. Like, how do you go up against Apollo? And then there's the frisbee, and I know it's just supposed to be tragedy, but like discus, I know, but it's a frisbee. Like the idea that this like one of the saddest love story endings in like in myth is because he gets hit in the head by a discus is like, oh, there's just so much in there too. Like, I focus it. I have to tell this like so often of just like they always die. Like it's like the earliest bury your gays, where it's like every time it is. It's so sad, but it is, and like. But like almost every time, yeah, like a god falls in love with a man of any kind, or of any, yeah, I guess any kind, it's still mythology. Like it just always ends badly, and then of course there's just like, again, back to Sappho and the women, like there's just like no stories of women and goddesses falling in love with other women. Like it's just, that's why I think that's even more evidence for my ongoing theories, which is just like Athena and Artemis both have no real, like, we could say oh my god, Callisto, we can say Callisto, but I mean, again, it's tragedy, and it's also still not really explicit. Like there's a lot of, oh, she just was a devotee to Artemis. Like it's so interesting how many stories there are of gods and romantic relationships with men, and like all the goddesses are like, no, if they didn't like a man, that's because they didn't like anyone. Orpheus, though, like, I mean, he, to my listeners, to remind them, his death story as it exists is just that he gets like torn apart completely by maenads, and then his like head floats down a river. So yeah, like I can see how it would lend itself to horror. I love that. Like, I don't know, do you want to tell me about that at all?
Yeah. So actually, his death scene is actually the very first thing that popped into my head, and it was the inspiration for the whole rest of the story.
Amazing. It's also like quite minor in the larger scheme of his story, but it's great. So I'm glad.
I mean, if you want me to, I have the excerpt pulled up. It's a brief little passage. Please. So obviously, this is from Orpheus's point of view. It's a first person story. And this is just like the very first paragraph that kind of like popped into my head. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write about this. So in human, the women move fast, the bacchantes. Soon their hands are on me. Their hands are in me. Their nails dig into flesh. And I feel my heart fall from my hand as each one grabs onto a limb. They are strong. They are mad. But all I think of is you. They break my body open like a pomegranate, and their nails, deep red, scoop out the seeds of my grief. My blood drips like juice into the grass. They break me into pieces. Skin splits here and there. Red is wet, a wetness that loosens me, a wetness I feel as the sorrowful river begins to swell over the shores, washing over me, flooding over the women and their bloodied nails. The water pulls the pieces of me into its hurried stream, washing them down, down, down.
I just want to say I'm definitely smiling too much for that poem, or that line, but that's wonderful. I just basically, one, I'm very glad I asked. So thank you for reading that. But also, I'm so excited to know about these because, like, one of the things, like, I love all the retellings, all the Greek myth retellings that are coming out right now. I absolutely love them. But my biggest gripe with the whole realm of this, and what I'm also working on my own end, is like, Greek myth is fantasy and it is horror.
Mm-hmm.
It is, like, that's it. And I feel like both of those things are the things that are least represented in the current realm, at least in terms of like the most mainstream. Like, I'm sure that they exist, but in terms of like the commonly popular Greek myth retellings these days, I do feel like the element of fantasy is bizarrely left out often for something that is fucking mythology, but especially horror. Like, Greek myths are horrifying. That's why I love them. They are fucked up. And I think that, like, examining them in that way is just so much, I don't want to say it's more interesting, but to me it is like a little bit more interesting than just like the stories, you know, on their kind of face, or like, I don't want to suggest that the retelling sanitize them, but I just think they don't focus on the parts that I like, which is the horror. Like, fuck, that's, yeah. The pomegranate. Oh, I really liked that. Thank you.
And that's one of the things that I like about Greek literature, is that it's so like genre bendy that I feel like a lot of it is not sequestered into like little groups of genres. And that is unfortunate. I agree with you. I think that a lot of retellings these days, a lot of them are very much focused on like a realism, like trying to make the Greek world feel very realistic to a very realistic audience. And you're right that there is all this horror and this horrible stuff that's like supernatural, fantasy-esque, that I feel like needs to be represented more.
Yeah. I'm currently trying to turn a myth into like a romantasy, but like a really fucked up romantasy.
Mm.
Yeah, but really emphasizing the fantasy element. Like, I'm trying to, you know, build my own version of the Greek mythological world that is a fantasy world, like in the same vein of any of the big fantasy realms, because like it is. Like, it is pre-existing, like, as a fantasy realm. You don't even have to invent it, you know? And I just feel like it's being underused. So, but yeah, along with the horror, because I think ignoring all of the, like, utter monstrosities that exist in Greek myth is just doing them a disservice. / I think it's just, yeah, indicative of what I want to read, which is the fucked up side of Greek myth. Hence this podcast, but... Anyway, ostensibly this episode is about Sappho. No, it really is. But I like hearing about the horror too. But yeah, I was gonna say the same thing all over again, but it's still true. I love that we have this woman's work, even though we don't have nearly enough of it. But yeah, that we get this sense of what kind of like a real person. To me, she feels like more of a real person than a lot of the other poets, and just like writing what she wants to write, like writing her angsty love poems to the women who hopefully, you know, like her back, but maybe they, you know, they had their own hurdles. Hopefully fewer in Lesbos than in Athens. But yeah, and I, you know, all of this came about because I think you must have just tweeted that you had a Sappho translation, and I was like, hi, can I have it? So I haven't figured out what I'm going to do yet, but I, you know, because you so lovely, graciously agreed to let me read some of it on the show. So I'm going to have done that at some point. I'm still figuring out how, because I'm very excited. But yeah, so I'm thrilled to talk about it too. I love the idea of doing this just because you wanted to, just because you love it. And I realized too, do you have information about any kind of release? Because you were going to, I feel like you were hopefully going to have something.
Yeah, so I think I really want to try to get this out about a year from now. So I think whenever this comes out, it would be like a great midpoint to when the date, or the general date. So I wanted to like do it sometime around Valentine's Day next year. And so it'll probably be in February.
Great, which is when we're recording, so very appropriate. Well, I'll check in with you in case you have anything updated by the time it releases, in case I can add that in afterwards. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much for doing this. This was so much fun. Do you have things you want to share with my listeners, particularly the Greek myth, horror / short stories that you've written? Because now I think people will want to read them. But anything you want to share?
I get Hyacinthus is out on Catapult when they were still running. The Orpheus story is in a small little publication. I think they are sold out, but I think in a few years I get the rights back to that story. And then
the fun of publishing short stories, I imagine.
And then I'm like up to my elbows in Euripides' Bacchae right now. So I'm like, hopefully in a year or two, I can like compile a nice little, I guess, collection of Euripides plays to also self-publish and throw out there. I'm having a lot of fun with Bacchae. It's one of my favorite plays.
So good. When you said up to your elbows, I was like, there is a lot to be said for saying that about Bacchae. Speaking of Orpheus, because I'm looking forward to that. Not least because I just fucking love Euripides. But yeah, Bacchae and Medea are my. I mean, I want to say they're my peak, but then every time I read something else, I'm like, well, I don't know, because Alcestis is there, and so is Helen, and Euripides is perfect.
He is by far my favorite. I will say that Aeschylus' Agamemnon is probably one of my very most favorite plays ever. But, Euripides is just, he is such he's such a horror writer. All of his plays are all about these horrible things. And he pushes it to the limit too.
To the point of it being almost dark comedy sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
Like he's got Jordan Peele kind of aspect, I think. It's dark and fucked up, but there's also there's an irony in there. There's layers, Yeah, fuck, Euripides is amazing. Because we're already kind of in this realm, I am so convinced that he was queer. Do you have thoughts? Have you formed opinions?
I actually have never thought about that. I have just, in my head, he's just an outlier in a number of ways, just because of how many women his plays focus on, how many women who do really horrible, fucked up things, and just all the voices of women and slaves and people that you don't typically see in plays get brought up in his material. And he really, I hate to throw around the word that he's a proto-feminist, because was he really a feminist?
He's one of the closest we have, though.
Yeah.
In terms of if we can put it on anybody, it is him.
I just enjoy Euripides because he puts forward all those marginalized voices of people who typically fall to the background in any other playwrights.
Yeah, no, exactly. He was interested in women as real people. That's how I tend to say it, is he wanted to write realistic women, flawed, broken, horrible women, but real ones instead of caricatures. Yeah. But I'm just I don't know. I forget which guest, so apologies, but I've definitely had a guest on who maintains that he was a closeted trans woman, which I could kind of see, or maybe it was that he's, anyway, just basically, there's some gender thing, going on. I could absolutely see that. But yeah, I mean, he's just, he's fucking interesting. Anyway, this is not about Euripides. But I could make anything about Euripides if I try. But thank you so much for doing this. Sappho is amazing. I'm really glad that you got to play around and have fun with her poetry, and that we got to talk about her.
I know. Thanks for having me on here. I love talking to anybody about Sappho, and I'm glad that you are super into her in the way that I am.
Who could not be, honestly, but I recognize that there are people out there, but they're wrong. Do you have any like social media handles or websites or anything that you want to promote as well?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm still going to call it Twitter at just,
Please.
my full name, Brendon, at Brendon Zatirka, no punctuation. And then my website is also just brendonzatirka.com. And that's where I typically have like links to other, writings that have been published out there.
Wonderful. You also saved me the trouble of asking how to pronounce your last name. So thank you. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm recording so many things up front, as I've said a few times now, because I have this travel. And so what that means is that I have been doing like 4 a day. And so now my voice is going. And also, I just am so overtaken by the horrors of the world that I just don't know how to say nice, happy things into this microphone. So thankfully, I have this conversation that was recorded before. So I am sorry for not giving this outro its due, but honestly, thank you so much to Brendon for talking to me. We had such a fun time. And yeah, you can read more everywhere that he mentioned. I've linked to everything in the episode's description, and hopefully we will all be able to read this Sappho translation very soon. Thank you all so much for listening. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the assistant producer. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love this shit.